Welcome to the Grace City Eugene podcast. We exist to help every person in our sphere of influence to encounter Christ, experience biblical community, and extend God's kingdom. You can learn more about us at gracecityeugene.com. Here's the podcast.
How's it going, family? Welcome to this week's episode of the Extended Cut. I'm Pastor Chris, and I'm here with the one, the only, Master Casey Olsen.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you, Casey. Thanks for being our guest this week. For those of you that were at church or have tuned in online, you know that Casey brought the word this week, which means we have a little role reversal in the Extended Cut. Speaking of Casey bringing the word, if you have not yet checked out the message this week titled,
He Dwelt Among Us.
He Dwelt Among Us.
I wasn't ready for that one.
By Casey, I was mixing it up. By Casey Olsen. Please go do that wherever you listen to your podcast or YouTube. You can also find the links on our social media from the service, but you will want to listen to that so that this makes sense. It's a great message. Starting our Unlocking Christmas series, our 2-week series.
Yes.
And
1 week, 2 teaching.
2
Isn't
episode.
that trippy?
It is 2 episode,
1 week, really.
Which is a great segue into this week's upcoming at Grace City. Our little segment,
flashing everything,
where we just remind you of some things happening in our community. And this week, we get to remind you that we do not have church on Sunday the 25th.
No, we don't.
Have fun with your family. Go celebrate Jesus and the
Figure
people
out the
God has
gender
given
of your
you
child.
to. If you're Casey, learn the gender of your child. I learned that, and if you watch the sermon, this will make sense to you. He joked about at 12:01 on Christmas being able to find out, but I heard that was vetoed, and he does in fact have to sleep first. And so it's looking more like a 4:30 a.m.
It's all right. You know, I was that kid my whole life that was up at 4 a.m. knocking on parents' doors and everything, and so it's nothing new. I've been playing this game my whole life. I can do it at least one more time.
I mean, if you were playing the game the way you did when you were a child, you probably already looked in that envelope. Let's be honest here.
I was.
Jess.
I had integrity even as a young man. So
wow, you're so set apart.
By God's grace.
Oh, rub off on me, Casey. Anyway, no church the 25th, but we do have our Christmas Eve service Friday, December 23rd, 5 p.m. at our normal meeting space at the Youth for Christ building, 2533 Crescent Avenue, for a couple hours a week, known as Grace City Eugene. And we would love for you to join us for that. It's a chance to go through the story of Christmas through scripture and song, all together as family, and it's a great way to kick off Christmas weekend. And so invite somebody who maybe has expressed interest in checking out our church, or maybe they haven't, but God's put them on your heart. It's a great opportunity to invite them into community. Whether somebody has been going to church or is following Jesus or not, people are often plenty comfortable engaging in a Christmas-type service and
Sure.
Easter. These are the times of the year where oftentimes folks are willing to check stuff out, and we're praying that they will hear a message of hope and that our world so much needs right now.
Amen.
And so please invite somebody and be praying, because we've been putting out some door hangers, inviting folks to, praying for just fruitfulness with that.
Yeah.
Our other announcement then is that since we're taking the 25th off, we'll be coming back to our normal Sunday time, 10:30 a.m. on January 1st. And we will be remembering God's faithfulness and what he's been doing in our last year through our Grace City Top 10 of 2022. So we're super excited about that. Would love to see you there as we kick off the new year. But that's what we got upcoming.
It's going to be great.
It's going to be amazing. So let's start off the Extended Cut this week with Case Face, Master Case, Casey Mitchell Olsen, whatever you want to call him, unpacking just briefly kind of what you went through this week. Jog our memories prior to us diving deeper.
Yeah, so this Unlocking Christmas focus that we're doing here first on Sunday and then at this upcoming Christmas Eve service is kind of seeking to, spoiler alert, present Christ as like the key Christ in his presence is what we need this season for it to be full of joy and peace and happiness. And this weekend, what I really kind of leaned in on and focused in is if we put our hope in our cultural expressions and experiences of celebrating Christmas, it's going to be bound to let us down. And there's a good chance over time that they will even contribute to ongoing issues and darkness that can so often pop up in this season. A lot of people have gone through really difficult experiences that have made the Christmas season not so fun. For me, I talked a lot about growing up in a home with divorced parents, but to others that might look like having lost a loved one, having gone through a financial crisis during a difficult year. There's so many different things that we might go through that all of a sudden what used to be this really great joyful experience to come together as a family and all that, like all of a sudden it's like I'm not looking forward to that like I usually would or usually am. And so basically we looked at John 1. Talks about kind of the divine origins of Jesus and how he came to this earth to be our source of hope and of light and of joy. And so the solution when you get distracted and when you get bogged down by our cultural experiences and expressions of celebrating Christmas is to turn our eyes back to him and to be intentional about making him the only light that's really, truly at the end of the day giving us hope and peace for both our experiences here and now and ultimately for what we have in eternity through him.
That's great. It was good stuff. Really loved the connections you made and the way that you landed the plane with very clear ways that this could be applied. Yeah. And it can often be where a sermon like this ends in posing a problem and here's what the Bible says, but not necessarily going to this is how this shapes what this looks like.
Sure.
I really appreciate how you did that. So, yeah. Aside from the fact that we were working on the building all week and limited time was available for you, what else was difficult about putting this sermon together?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what I had been struggling processing with, and I was grateful that we were working on the building because I got to talk about it some with you, is there's so many different great directions you could go with a Christmas sermon and ways that God will bless, God will use that would be appropriate and totally awesome to preach on a Sunday. Do I do Luke's narrative? Do I look at Matthew's? Do I look at John's, which is not really like a nativity, like Christmassy passage, but I think, and as I presented in this sermon, and viewed with the right perspective and light, you can see it as like an important piece in the story of Jesus, a really critical and necessary one. And so I think in processing and preparing for the sermon, it was difficult to kind of have like a blank canvas of where should I go with this? What should I talk about? What do I want to do? I knew that God had really put it on my heart to talk about like the difficulties of the holiday season and to really try to address that for folks because that's so much of my story and my experience. And I just know that it's inevitable for all of us in some way or another, on a minor level, on a major big scale, like it's something we're all going to face at some point where all of a sudden like the joy that Christmas maybe usually brings you is not there and you're kind of like, oh, what do I do now? How do I work through this? And so I knew that was like very much the heart of what I wanted to preach and just needed to pray through like, God, how do I make this aligned with your word and with principles and things that you've established? I don't want to just go up there and say what I want to say. I want to preach the word because that's what needs to be preached from those stages. And God, use my story in whatever ways that are compatible with what you've got going on and with what you're doing. And so that was probably the most difficult, but through prayer, through conversations with you and with Jess this week, like was able to come out as like, no, it might feel a little unorthodox to go to John 1, but I think it's what I'm supposed to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was great.
Thanks.
And then you saved the...
Oh, that's what that beep was. I was like, I don't think my watch makes that noise.
Well,
We're back.
We're back. I had a thought, but it shut off like the lights.
Said something about saving something, but...
Well, then on the other side, Casey.
Yes?
Maybe it'll come back to me. What brought you the most joy in putting this together? Oh, I remember.
Oh, here it is.
Thank you for saving the
I don't know how I
fruit for
edit
me.
this, but we had technical issues.
Yeah,
So.
maybe you don't even edit it, and it's just like...
Yeah, we'll just keep going.
I was grateful because you left the scriptures that I wanted to preach on this week.
Oh, that's
for
great.
Me.
Look at that.
Look at that.
Look at that.
Thank you for your selfless sacrifice.
You're welcome.
In preaching Trinitarian theology for Christmas.
Anytime.
So what brought you the most joy this week?
Yeah, I mean, in just trying to practice what I preach, like, I read a Christmas narrative, a nativity narrative every morning the week of in the sermon, and even though I didn't necessarily like preach that, it was in my heart. It was on my mind. It was something I just really spent a lot of time thinking about this week, and that was just a really cool process going through. And like, some days it was a quicker read through and I just wanted to read it and familiarize myself. Sometimes I was sitting there a little bit thinking about different aspects or dynamics, or, you know, why is Luke's so long and this one is so much shorter, and then John doesn't even talk about Jesus's birth and all these kinds of things. And so that was like a really cool process, and I think got to fuel some of that heart for application in the conclusion of my sermon to say, hey, go spend time in this stuff this week because it's good and will bless you, because that was my experience this week. Was being encouraged as I was spending time just meditating on the Word.
No, I love that. And as you start to understand the characters and the people behind the Gospels more, you start to understand more of why it is that way, right?
Yeah.
Like, Luke was writing as a historian.
Yeah.
Like, there was much more of a focus on that. So, of course, he's going to get into more of the details. And then Matthew was there, but he had a different perspective, right? And John, you mentioned it, like, his whole goal was to, like, prove who Jesus was through his, like, supernatural works,
right.
Which is cool you mentioned that, because our first sermon series of next year will be going through all the miracles in the book of John and what they teach us about Jesus. And so, nice job sliding that in there, but...
It was an undergrad Bible class right there. I did like a New Testament survey class once, and I had never at that time read like summarized purposes of what the four Gospels were, and that was the first time I ever did. And I don't even remember who the author of that was, but that's where I picked up on those things, was from a New Testament survey class. But it's changed the way, and it helps the way you read those books.
It does.
Is when you know, all of a sudden you're like, that's why John focuses on this so much. Yeah. That's why Luke tells stories the way he does. And
he's a doctor who's telling writing a historical piece, right? Yeah. It's phenomenal, and it helps you put all these different like things into context. So instead of reading them and be like, this person said it different than this person, now it's contradictory. It's like, you and I could go through the same experience and we'd explain it differently, right? And so it actually adds breadth to our understanding. It doesn't contradict, but the kind of the cultural narrative is, oh, these two guys saw it different. So I'm like, no, they recorded it differently. It doesn't mean it could have been on the one side of the room from the other and didn't see. I mean, there's all this that putting it in its proper place.
Not only do we have different perspectives of it, but we have different audiences that we're speaking to as well. So you're going to tell the story differently based off what you know about like your neighbors and your neighborhood and how you communicate versus what I know about my neighbors and their backgrounds and their experiences. I know this neighbor does have a church background, so I could leave out some of these details and I could assume they know some of this. And you see that, you know, with Luke, who's writing towards trying to convince Jews that Jesus is the promised Messiah and all these kinds of things. And both the author's perspective, the audience's background, and all that makes such a big difference in the reading.
It makes things come alive much more, for sure.
Yeah.
So, as you've continued to process and think about, your message and the material you're going through, was there any contextual details that stood out as interesting or notable in your preparation that just didn't quite make the cut on Sunday?
Yeah, too many of them.
Figured.
Because John 1 is just ridiculous.
So what was the main one that was the last one to get to the cutting room floor, if you will?
Well, if I can be honest, I snuck it in, but it could have been more of a focus. Was just letting the light shine in and through you to others. Like, Jesus is the light that shines through the darkness, which is the case that he makes throughout John 1. And then as John's gospel goes on, you see this transition of the light came to earth, and now Christ's disciples get to be bearers of that light to others as well. And I had that in as final kind of community moment. I thought it would be a really great piece to kind of wrap up and send everyone out on. As Andy Stanley talks about in his sermon methods. He talks about sending everyone home with this vision of what we could be. Imagine if we are a community that does this, that owns this, and what will happen, and which is such a compelling vision if you can do that well. And as I was sitting on that point more and more, I was like, man, this could just be a whole sermon in and of itself, is the responsibility that Christ has given us now to bear that light, to be the ones that continue to go out and show it to more and more people, that put it on lampstands, that don't hide it away in a culture where it is so easy to hide it away. And you could have just sat on that point alone for a whole sermon. Yeah. And so that was one of those points that and it's just so much of our church's heartbeat is we don't want to keep things for ourselves. We know that Christ has commissioned us to go and reach folks in our spheres of influence. And so it was something that I wanted very badly to fit into the sermon and found a way to at the end, but I think it is something that could have been unpacked and really stuck on for even longer than that.
I mean, you could do a 4-week sermon series titled Light of the World and have all the different ways that looks, that it was in the Bible and what that means for us. And so I hear you on that for sure. Yeah. I'll write that down. Yeah. Coming in 2024, the Light of the World.
Well, and then additionally, didn't even touch really on anything with John the Baptist, just kind of sped over that because that wasn't the point of what we were focusing on in that passage, but there was just a ton there. Thinking about the idea, I believe, so it's kind of broken down, and that passage is broken down into 4 paragraphs. The third paragraph is all about how people rejected the light. His own people turned away,